So everybody, thank you very much for attending our continuing series, A Road to City Hall. It's great to see all of you. I will briefly read an intro and then we will get to it. So as many of you know, Andrew Yang is a former presidential candidate, a native New Yorker, an entrepreneur and philanthropist. In 2011, Andrew started Venture for America, a nonprofit fellowship program which gives the nation's top college grads the skills and resources they need to help create economic opportunity in developing cities. Venture for America quickly received national recognition. In 2012, Andrew was named Champion of Change by the Obama administration for his extraordinary impact on communities. In 2015, he was selected as a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship. Most recently, last year, he founded Humanity Forward, a nonprofit organization dedicated to enacting human-centered policies through bipartisan political action. In the year since it launched, Humanity Forward has successfully worked with Congress to secure $166 billion in direct relief for American families in 2020. Andrew has a bachelor's degree in economics and political science from Brown University and a JD from Columbia University, just like yours truly. And now we are excited to have him here with us tonight. So take it away, Andrew. Thanks again so much for spending some time with us.
Thanks, Stephen. Wow, Columbia Law, same year, I take it?
I don't think so, unfortunately. 1989.
I just want to give a shout out to all the environmental lawyers here on this call, because that's exactly the kind of thing that people entered law school wanting to do. And then, as Stephen can attest, very few people actually did it. a lot of people wound up in other environments. I have a running joke that Big Law Departure Day should be some kind of holiday, like when someone decides to leave the big law firm that they join after law school. Also, I just want to make sure you hear this before we get on to other topics. I think Mike Bloomberg is going to be able to help again. I had a talk with his team, and Mike is apparently very, very frustrated that he's investing more in cities that are not New York City, and he's hoping to change that next year. So I thought that some of you might enjoy hearing that scuttlebutt. It's great to be here with you all, and you all have been fighting for a better, healthier, greener, more sustainable future for years and years, since before it was the thing to do, and everyone benefits from your work. I mean, for me, I'm a dad. I've got two young boys, 8 and 5, and I think all the time about the mess we're leaving them. Most of the time, people thought that mess was kind of years away, but now we sense that that mess is much more immediate. And I think that for you all too, you've probably been horrified by the impact of climate change here in New York and around the country. That it is much more real and present. I think I got some heat during one of the presidential debates when I said, look, like according to the numbers, we're already past a point when, unless we were to frankly cut emissions by 50%, that we're going to be able to mitigate the impacts of this. So at this point, we have to try and do multiple things at once, including accepting that some people should be moving away from flood-prone areas and the rest of it. I don't know if you all remember this. It's one of the early debates, and then people yelled at me about it. And then I think we started moving people from flood-prone areas, a number of months later, as the wildfires were breaking out in California, and people were experiencing various versions of extreme weather. So incredibly grateful to you all for making this case again before it was completely obvious to everybody. And the question really is, how many changes can we make in the time that we have that will help us try and bring us back from the brink? And New York City is front and center in this challenge because we are very flood prone and going to be subject to various natural disasters and impacts of climate change. One of my friends, Basilia Yao, was part of the team. Some of you might know Basilia. Carter, did you work with Basilia? Anyway, she was on the team that Bloomberg enlisted to try and write up a report as to what climate change resilience would look like in New York City. And they came up with a very robust program that, unfortunately, I think the price was somewhere in the 11 digits. It was above $10 billion. And then shortly thereafter, Mike left office, and then we've had 8 years of de Blasio, and while things have gotten worse, not better, in terms of our climate change resilience. So in addition to the positive news on Bloomberg, I hope to bring some other news, which is I think that we're going to get a very, very significant investment from the federal government in terms of infrastructure and green infrastructure over this next number of months. When I've talked to the folks on Capitol Hill, they've said that that is where their attention is going to turn right now. And one thing I'm going to be proud of, I think maybe for the rest of my life, was helping get Chuck Schumer to become Senate Majority Leader. Because if you can imagine Mitch McConnell blocking all these proposals right now, where we'd be. So now we're going to have a shot at it. I think that this next number of years, building a green infrastructure is going to be one of the great economic opportunities for New York City. It's going to be one of the great federal investments. It's going to be one of the great job generators. And hopefully we can do some of the things that you all have been agitating for and fighting for during the next several years, things that people have said, well, we don't have the money for that. I think we're going to get the money for it. I think that this is going to be the great project. I certainly hope I'm mayor. And if I am the mayor, you have my word that I'm going to be very committed to maximizing both the level of resources we get for this infrastructure upgrade. And I want to deploy it as effectively, as sustainably, and impactfully as possible. So excited to be here. Happy to take questions. I can give you more about, like my background and the rest of it, but I feel like most of you kind of have a sense of my background and all. Though if you want, you can, ask questions on that level too.
Well, we have a series of questions, I think, So
yeah, I know, but I thought, there might be some other, like, I don't know.
We'll get to that. We'll get through these fast, and then we can get to that.
I like it.
You've already alluded to this, right? We need to act fast, right? We need to act in the next 10 years to avoid the worst impacts. And we need a plan. We've had two plans. You mentioned the Bloomberg plan. Obviously, de Blasio's had a plan, one NYC. If you're elected, what would your plan look like, and how would you make sure that we're making real measurable progress? Since, as you pointed out, over the last few years, we haven't gained progress, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons. And then how would you, prioritize addressing impacts on overburdened communities who have been disproportionately impacted by pollution, extreme heat, the additional rain we're expecting, the storms, and the rising sea levels?
As a parent, I think the thing that speaks to me most in terms of priorities is the increased level of asthma among children in Western Queens and other parts of New York City, Northern Bronx too. I find that to be unconscionable. Like if I was a parent in one of these neighborhoods and I saw my child laboring in that way, and I do have, one of my kids does have respiratory issues, and so. But he doesn't have respiratory issues because he's in a high pollutant zone because of dirty power. So that to me is the first place that we should be looking to remediate. If you're poisoning your kids, that doesn't get much worse. The plan, and this could be because Basilia Yao is like an advisor to my campaign and a friend, but I am using the Bloomberg plan as like the launching off point. With the goal of trying to implement a lot of the plan laid out that weren't able to. But when you ask about the priorities, like the priorities are around human impact. And so the things that we can do that will alleviate health burdens are number one. Of the issues you named, like the easy fixes, like the low hanging fruit, if you can fix concrete heat pools simply by painting roofs white, like that would be something I'd be excited to execute on very early. I would try and prioritize the quick and easy wins, because I think people need to see progress in this dimension, and they need to see that the progress actually is not onerous. It's not like costing them money, costing them jobs. Like, we just need to do the basic things. Another basic thing that I'm excited about is window fittings. I think that modernizing some of our apartments so that they conserve heat better, and people would see an impact on their bills, I think would be another way to introduce popular support. Right now, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what these changes can mean to families.
think that's fair.
I don't know what the intended duration of my my
No.
answer is.
That's I was looking to take myself off of mute.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So, we're seeing, as we're making a comeback here, congestion is an issue that's coming back. It's one that we would like not to come back.
I've noticed that.
Yes. People are taking their cars more. We heard some good news from Pat Foy this morning and last night that the federal government is going to work on that, but working on congestion pricing, which is a big priority for us at our organization. And oftentimes we have major infrastructure for transportation. It's located in, and as one of my books, as everybody knows, that I'm sitting atop, is The Power Broker. We know that there's many times this infrastructure was systematically built to burden low-income communities. And when congestion pricing is enacted, it's going to have some impact. There's other things that the city can do without having to go hat in hand to Albany, which, as you know, doesn't always work. So what is your vision for how to move people around more efficiently on our streets, how to rebalance the use of our street space in favor of public use, and reduce emissions maybe by looking at what we're doing with the city-owned fleet and other vehicles like school buses?
I start with the last aspect first. We should be trying to electrify our fleet as quickly as possible. Buses, because they're the most visible, I think they'd send a very positive message if you were riding an electric bus, and that was emission free. I think we need to build out our charging station infrastructure so that if we do electrify the city's fleet, then people are able to recharge all over the 5 boroughs. That to me is the greatest opportunity. And I think that the tone shift or leadership change there would be really powerful. Because if you're riding an electric bus, or if you're a city employee and you got converted to an electric car, it's a Volt, and you recharge instead of refuel, that changes a lot. I think you all, probably a lot of you already, have Teslas and ride electric cars and the rest of it. But the first time you ride an electric car, it really does change your mindset, because you have a conception of an electric car and then you ride in it, or a conception of an electric bus and you ride in it, and then you start thinking, wow, we really can do things cleaner and more sustainably. I'm a huge fan of congestion pricing. I think the goal for the city has to be, and this is, to me, crucial to our eventual recovery, and I'll introduce my personal background here. So I moved to New York as a 21-year-old law student at Columbia. I did not own a car, which is probably very standard. And I proceeded to keep not owning a car for the next 19 years. I eventually bought a car when I had my second child. And I think that the value proposition of New York City to young people in particular has to be, you do not need to own a car to live here. So that it means investing in walkability, in bikeability. I'm a biker, and I bike, well, I did before we outgrew it, but I biked either one of my boys to school every morning. So that to me is what we should be trying to invest in, is a city where folks feel like owning a car is optional. That means implementing something like congestion pricing. If someone visits New York City, we should be trying to encourage them not to drive. And if they do drive, we should charge them for the privilege. One of the things about congestion pricing that I don't think people have fully realized is that if you're going to have congestion pricing, you're going to have a lot of people trying to avoid congestion pricing, which means they're probably going to try and park above the congestion pricing zone, which probably means you need some kind of permit street parking like in those neighborhoods. And New York City is, I believe, the only major city that does not have residential parking permits. And so I think at a minimum, we're going to have to be piloting residential parking permits in Upper Manhattan, north of the congestion pricing zone. And if that goes well, then I think it's something we can explore all over the city. My anecdotal sense of things, and I've gotten different data points, you all might know this better than I do, is that a lot of people bought cars during the pandemic. That if you were living in New York and you were here and you have kids, you're like, all right, I guess I'm gonna buy a car. And so the hope is that we can get some of those people to give up that car. And I think one of the ways to do that is going to be to have some allocation of parking resources, with a goal again of making it so that, and I don't want to I don't want to drive people with cars crazy or out of the city. But the goal has to be to frankly reward the folks who are using public transportation. And then one way to reward them is to invest some of our street mileage on walkability and bikeability, as opposed to making it all for automobiles.
Great. You might also need to look in Queens by the bridges, and Brooklyn to that matter. So on parks.
You mean they're gonna park their cars there? Yeah, they probably would. You're probably right.
Yeah.
Is that what you meant?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
what I meant.
yeah, you're right.
Those are places where we're going to be looking for some air quality monitoring as well, that we've already been talking to the state and city about. So parks make up about 14% of New York City's land, but the agency gets less than 1% of the total city budget. And we've formed a coalition, Play Fair for Parks, calling for investments in both capital projects and maintenance of our parks and open spaces, which, as we've all seen during the pandemic, is one of the only things you could actually do and enjoy, since almost everything else was shut down. And they're also, I think you sort of alluded this a little bit in your introductory, right? Parks are really their infrastructure, right? They provide significant ecosystem benefits to our communities, with, absorbing stormwater, absorbing pollution, absorbing carbon dioxide. So can you talk about your commitment to funding for parks and open spaces, and how you'll ensure, in particular, that communities with little or no access to green spaces, unlike me here in Hell's Kitchen, with 3 very close, very well-maintained parks. Thank you, Madeline. I enjoy your park very frequently. How we can make sure that we're getting those to these other communities that aren't so fortunate.
Julie, I'm in Hell's Kitchen too. I don't know how many of you knew that. It's true. We do have several parks within Stone's Throw. I want to invest in our parks for a number of reasons, but I'm going to actually give you a very, very practical reason. We actually have the operating flexibility to do so. So what do I mean? And you all know this, is that you can fund park expansion and construction out of the capital budget and then push some of the financing around like in a way that's different from other commitments. And I agree with you, Julie, that parks have been shown to be a lifeline during this pandemic. I spoke to a woman on the Lower East Side who said to me she never actually used the park pre-pandemic, but now with the pandemic, she uses the park every day, and now she's like a park believer, park advocate. And so one of the things I want to commit to is to either expand or build 1 green space per borough, and that can include completing some of the park construction projects that have gone by the wayside during the pandemic. I do not believe that park construction going by the wayside is the right approach right now. I actually think it should be opposite, that we should be trying to build during this time as one of the sources of economic activity, but just trying to make progress during this time, while we also fire back the small business economy and the rest of New York's economy to try and gain back some of the 600,000 jobs we're missing, get our unemployment levels down to national average or historical level. So I will invest in green spaces. In New York City, it's actually quite modest in the scheme of things. Like one of the questions I was asked earlier today was about presidents and Teddy Roosevelt. And if you think about Teddy Roosevelt, he was talking about like national parks and setting aside like hundreds or thousands of acres for these national parks that we still enjoy. Here in New York City, I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about like, green spaces and parks to help these neighborhoods be more livable. It's a very modest investment in the scheme of things, but it's an investment I believe in deeply. As a parent too. I mean, if you have a park to bring your kid, it's a game changer. And if you don't have a park to bring your kid, you can become very sad. And if you become sad, then, the kid learns worse. A lot of bad things can happen.
I will tell you that land is more expensive here in New York City. I know that that's shocking news, but as the agency that bought the most land in the state of New York, it was a lot cheaper to buy it in the Adirondacks.
Oh, I'm sure per acre, the multiplier is going to be, something ridiculous, Julie. But, we don't need a gajillion acres here in New York.
That's true. So one of the things that's most visible to all New Yorkers and uniting us all together as one is seeing garbage on streets. It is a uniting factor here in New York City. It's also a climate issue that I think a lot of people don't realize. And there's been a commitment in One NYC to achieve zero waste to landfills by 2030, which is, getting all of our really moving towards a much more robust recycling program. What would you do to reduce the amount of waste that we're sending to landfills, and how might you help bring back the organic waste collection program that had been started here in New York, and is something that the current mayor had committed to expanding to all New Yorkers?
My phrase on this would be composting is addictive. And so what I mean is that when you introduce composting, the adjustment is difficult for a lot of people. But then after they get in the habit, then it becomes quite addictive. So that has to be something we incentivize and support in various ways. I think one of the problems that we've seen right now is that we've kind of gone half in, where it's like you started to form the habit, and then just when it was starting to break through, then they've kind of pulled back. So you have to commit fully to having the necessary waste collection and receptacles and guidance so that people get in the habit of composting. But after you get used to composting, it becomes something that people do very naturally. And it makes you more sensitive to what you're consuming and what you're throwing out. But I think it changes people's eating habits in very fundamental ways. And so that to me is one of the great opportunities where waste is concerned. I will say that one of the pain points for New Yorkers right now is just our trash pickups not as efficient as we'd like it to be, regardless of the nature of the trash or how it's sorted. And I think that's something that's fueling like an eroding sense of confidence. So this is something that I really want to improve. That legitimately, and it sounds marginal, if as mayor people notice that we're better at managing waste and that there are less garbage bags on the street, like I think that would be tremendous for New York City. And I do think having a more deliberate and committed approach to composting will be a part of that.
So do you compost?
I compost intermittently. I'm not composting right now that we just moved to a new place, but I have composted and I found it addictive and refreshing and happy. And then I missed it when we were in another environment that made composting difficult, also known as New York City. Anyway.
Understood. So too often communities of color and low-income neighborhoods are burdened by years of environmental racism and pollution. From the dirty bus depots to the stacks emitting toxins that you talked about, like in Western Queens, to housing with lead paint and mold. These all contribute to chronic illnesses like asthma, greater risk of cancer, stunted growth and learning. How will you rectify these past decisions and ensure that future policies enacted by your administration don't disproportionately burden the communities with these negative environmental impacts?
My main mission in running for mayor is going to be to try and improve the way of life for as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And the unfortunate reality is that if you're going to try and improve people's way of life, the place to start is in communities of color, because the needs are so much greater and the abuses are so much more prevalent. So one of the changes I want to make is to actually change the city charter to have reducing the racial imbalance in health outcomes as part of the mission of every city agency. Because you make what you measure. And so if every city agency now has data on the fact that life expectancy is 10 years lower if you're born in Brownsville than if you're born in the West Village, then you start looking at that and saying, okay, why is that? And then if you start examining the environments in Southeast Queens or Brownsville or other neighborhoods, then you find environmental contaminants and all sorts of problems that contribute to that. And now every agency has that on their scorecard saying, like, have we done something that alleviates these racial inequities? And I'm sure that the environment's going to be an enormous part of that. And then if you're making changes that make that worse, obviously that's going to be terrible. And it's going to be evident, I believe, based upon the fact that we're going to be gathering and reporting this data. And so changing the city's mandate will end up touching the operations of all of the agencies, because everyone will look at a certain period and say, okay, like, did we make any progress? Like, are Black communities getting any healthier relative to other communities? And so this to me has been overdue for a long time, because right now you can sweep up a lot of stuff in averages. But if you start homing in on neighborhood by neighborhood data, then the injustices become very, very evident very quickly.
So speaking of injustices, lead poisoning is still an issue here for New York City. We just saw in the New York Times earlier this week that this is still a significant problem. There's been a lack of enforcement by HPD. There's been fewer cases detected during the pandemic because of suspended inspections and delayed pediatric screening appointments. And public health officials are concerned there's going to be an uptick in blood lead levels cases as we move forward. What would you do to make sure exposure to this toxin is finally eliminated?
Well, we have to invest in a massive upgrade of the buildings and infrastructure that were produced with lead paint and these contaminants. And this makes me think of NYCHA, though, I'm sure there are other structures that are non-NYCHA related. Excuse me. And so the problem right now is that the cost is being borne by families and not the city. So what we have to do is we have to invest the realistically tens of billions of dollars necessary to upgrade our infrastructure so that it's safe for families. And my hope is that we get that money from the feds next year. As a parent, again, and this is not as terrible as what happened in Flint, but it's not that far behind, that if you're raising kids in environments that impede their mental health and development in many cases, then you're not doing anything right. And so I want the city to be putting resources to work to try and upgrade infrastructure that in many cases families should not have been living in.
So you talked about this at the beginning a bit, but we know that climate change and environmental protection are not just good for the environment, but they also can support tens of thousands of family-sustaining jobs. So what would you do, and you've alluded to this a little bit, to bolster green jobs, and how would you help to prioritize that there's a just transition? You're making sure that people in communities who have been confronted with the worst impacts of climate change have an opportunity to be part of that green economy in the future.
I'd say there are two big things I would want to propose. So how many Americans have their houses powered by solar panels? It's a relatively low percentage relative to the number that would benefit from it, even economically. The problem is that the payback period is too long. That they're going to have to put a certain amount of money up front, and Americans don't have much money to spare, and so they look around and say, I'll just go buy with my older power sources. So the big thing that we need to do here in New York, and I'm like a kind of wonky numbers guy in this way, is essentially front load the benefits. And we're the world's financial capital. This really should be something that we're expert in, where if you're going to get paid back for an infrastructure, and I referred to it a little bit earlier, is that window treatment. It's like that window treatment will pay for itself in 6 years or less. The problem is that you don't want to pay for it up front because, again, you don't have any money. So what New York City has to do is New York City has to put a very, very significant pool of funds up. And I genuinely think that we could have massive partners in this just to say, look, we're going to get the money back, but we're going to put the money up front in terms of infrastructure upgrades and change consumer behavior. Where if you put in this window treatment or, and it's not realistic in some of our contexts, but if like a commercial landlord converts to solar or other forms of power, eventually we'll get paid back and we will help you pay for the upfront infrastructure spend. The second thing is to try to make it so that the people who are closest to the work in the community get a chance to do those jobs. And some of these jobs are very, very trainable, like painting roofs and solar panel installation is probably a trickier one, but the window fitting one's pretty easy. Like there are a lot of things that we can do. And what we should do as a city is ensure that at a minimum, and I would say even higher, levels of Black and brown New Yorkers get access to these jobs in the same way, but more effectively, frankly, than the proportion of city contracts that get allocated to minority and women-owned businesses. We should be trying to make the same allocation where green jobs are concerned, where we look up and say, if you're working in a community that's majority Black or Latino, maybe not a majority, but maybe a majority of the workers in those operations should be of these communities, because a lot of these jobs are going to be solid $15 an hour type jobs that a lot of folks in these communities would benefit from, and then they'd be trained up, they'd be skilled, they'd be able to move on to another neighborhood. But it's not going to happen natively. If you just let the market do it, people will not pay for this, and people will not hire folks that are representative of the city itself.
So how often do you take mass transit?
Every day.
Great. And do you use reusable bags?
Oh gosh, guilty. This is a definite sometimes. Like I forget all the time.
It's like the composting. You'll get into the habit soon.
Probably true, Julie.
No, I've been doing it for a while, so it's all good.
I'm all the time. I'm like, oh, I need to pick this up, and then I don't have the bag with me anyway.